Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital and manufacturing. In this episode, Jonathan, Scott, and Jen Ferello are joined by Eric Doubell, Razorleaf's CEO, and take a tour around the digital engineering industry to distinguish who's who in the zoo and what they do. This industry has many different types of vendors, and it can be confusing when buying technology. Do I buy directly from an OEM or a reseller? And what does a systems integrator do? What are the advantages and disadvantages in working with any one of these organizations? Listen into this conversation and learn how it all works. Here's Jonathan, Jen, and Eric.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are talking about how to navigate the digital manufacturing landscape. It's not as easy as it sounds. There are a lot of different players. There's a lot of functions out there that providers offer. And there's a lot of crossover. Organizations that have a primary function, but they also have secondary and tertiary offerings. So our goal today is to kind of give you a roadmap of sorts, who to talk to, when to reach out, some of the different players. We're not going to go through an exhaustive list of all of the players out there. Number one, we don't have enough time. And number two, we don't want to be seen to be picking favorites or anything along those lines. There are a lot of folks out there. And we just want to give you a rough guideline of where to go and how to get started. Today, I'm joined with my colleague, Jonathan Scott.
Hey, everybody. And we've also got Eric Doubell with us today. And I know, Eric, you've been around this industry for a few minutes. Glad to have you here to talk about, kind of who we know in the industry and who's around and what they do, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks for having me on today.
So getting started, that's where you start, right? Who do you talk to? If you're going to go out there and okay, we're going to start by implementing somebody told me we're going to do a PLM system. I'm new to the industry. Where do I start?
Or even broader than that. Somebody said the words, digital transformation to me. What does that mean? Okay. How do I even figure out how that applies to what part of my business, that kind of thing. I think the first thing you think of is, getting some guidance. Now a lot of people know where they want to start or they have some idea, but even just for context, if you're thinking, how does this fit into the overall organization? Who can help me understand that? There are people out there who look at these digital product tools and technologies from that broad of a perspective. I think there are a lot of industry analysts who look at our industry, but there are also folks who maybe look at companies more holistically. There are probably two different categories there.
So with the industry analysts, that's an interesting one because people can use them in a lot of different ways. So maybe you're trying to figure out what tools you need. Maybe you're trying to figure out what part of the, digital life cycle you want to try to manage. Maybe you're trying to figure out how to explain this to your management to justify it because you've been at a conference and seen that everyone's talking about, manufacturing execution or PLM or whatever. So the analysts play a really different role, and depending on what you need, depends if you're going to go to, a specific kind of analyst or more of a general analyst. Someone like a Gartner that talks about all technology, or someone like a SimData who focuses on, PLM or MES or the, digital transformation.
Yeah, and I think you brought up some good points, Eric, about sometimes those folks are very helpful at providing educational content. I know some of them even offer certifications specific to certain areas. And I see a lot of them doing research and surveys and things meant to give people metrics. When folks are thinking about return on investment of their projects, they might be asking questions of those analysts and, have you gotten research on this or that topic, that kind of thing. I think they bring a lot to the table in those areas. I know, just a few other names to throw out there. We've worked with folks at Tech Clarity, Lifecycle Insights. I'm not even thinking of all the names, right? Because there are a ton of people who focus on this and sometimes have a specialty, like you said.
Yeah, so that's if you kind of know that you want to be playing in this arena. Sometimes, that's not sufficient to educate your executives or to set the 5-year, the 10-year plan for the organization. So, that's when I think the higher end, larger management consultants come into place, not someone who's specific to PLM or specific to CAD or engineering systems, but someone like PwC or a Deloitte, one of those folks that comes in and helps set a whole company strategy, a piece of which is maybe digital transformation.
Right. Or they're setting that digital transformation strategy for the whole enterprise and saying, hey, there's a piece of that in product development and manufacturing, and there's a piece of that on our, retailer sales front end or something. But like you said, they might be looking at an enterprise type of transformation holistically and bringing some of these product digitalization tools, bringing that into the picture. But to your point, those folks can look at really the overall picture. They might even be the ones bringing this up to people.
Yeah, and but both these groups are kind of high-level planning, right? So it's how you make the plan to decide where you want to go, but it really doesn't provide necessarily the detail you need to talk about how you're really going to get there. So you've got the map, but now you got to get your feet on the street and start doing something. And that's where I think a lot of the other players come in.
You mean drilling down a little bit more specific? So even more specific than like SIM data or tech clarity, but actually getting into functionality, specific areas like MBD. So, companies like Action Engineering or, for organizational change management, share PLM, something along those lines?
Yeah. And that can be part of, someone like Action who's doing MBD. That can be part of a larger project, shared PLM, someone who's doing, management of, what people think about the systems and how to employ systems, things like that. That can fit any kind of project. And then you've got, just education, feet on the street people that need to be educated. So, how did the rank and file understand what PLM is going to do for them or what MES is going to do for them and how their jobs specifically are going to change, what it means and how it all works together. So then you get into kind of the education cycle that folks like not only the specialty consultants that you mentioned, but the resellers maybe do or the software vendors, depending on how large a customer you are and what kind of buying model you're working through. Because there's a lot of steps in the education process to actually start implementing the software before you've even implemented it. And then you've got all the education that takes place once you start to implement it.
That's a really interesting point you're bringing up, Eric. And I know our podcast today isn't about, like the buying cycle and how people get into these, but in a way it is, right? Understanding the landscape for when you're undergoing a process like this. But you separated something that's really important. There's a lot of education that happens before people define their project or pick their software or that kind of thing. And then there's education that happens once you know what you're doing. You've got a project, you're going to implement some tool, you're going to change the way your organization behaves, and you have to train people and educate them and bring them up to speed. But there's a lot of education that folks in the industry do for potential customers on products, product capabilities, what's the state of the art, best practices, that kind of thing. And like you said, there's specialty consultants who might focus on a certain area, but there are also resellers, people who resell the software written by someone else. But the reason they're value-added resellers is they bring that value of connecting the software to the market and what people need it for and how they might use it and how they've seen other customers use it and that kind of thing. That's what you're talking about, right?
Exactly. Not to be a sales pitch, but, so for us as a systems integrator, we will often get involved when, after someone like PwC has been in there or even a SimData and has defined the overall strategy and the kinds of technologies. And then either we or someone else is helping them drill down in those technologies. The technology gets picked. And then it's about, well, what do we need to do? What specialists do we need to bring in to cover skill sets that the organization doesn't have? How is this thing going to be laid out in a plan? How's it going to be configured? What people need to be educated on what capabilities and functionalities so that the system can be made to work for them. So there's education through the whole process, all the way to the post-implementation, and then you've got your training. So education is, I think, a consistent thing, and guidance is a consistent thing throughout the process, because even during the life of the implementation of the solution that's been chosen, there are decisions and education that has to happen to make the system work the way that it needs to work to get the benefits that are the inputs to the process.
I like the way you laid that out. It's, we started by educating ourselves on the business itself. We're getting down into the specifics of, okay, we're going to do a PLM implementation, talking to some of the systems integrators about how do we get that started? What are the steps there? And then moving to, when you've got a better idea of what you want to do, and then moving into the area of resellers. What tools do you want to do it with? because I think it's important as you're going through that education process that you're picking appropriate people to educate you, because vendors are going to have a very specific view on life.
I think that's exactly right, Jen. All through the process, if you're getting educated, you have to think about where you're getting your information, and are people bringing a bias to you? Are they tool agnostic? Do they have a focus on, what they're trying to sell you? Because it's it's a known fact. We all are, right? All of us out there trying to sell something have a bias. It's just putting that together in a way that serves your need as a customer.
Yeah, as you go down that path, you get more from theory and ideas down into practice and process. And there's different players along the way. There's a lot of overlap, and people can play in multiple levels there in any of the categories we've talked about. But you go down through from idea to implementation. And the reason that there's so many players, it's because kind of the ecosystem is so complicated. As we talk about what tools you're going to use or what you're going to need to implement the system, there's a whole lot of players that come into play.
I think there's an important point to make there that isn't always obvious. And when we do this as systems integrators, I think it brings a lot of value to customers, but sometimes customers don't think about taking this approach. And what I mean is teaming, right? That we're naming a bunch of people who play different roles in the industry, but sometimes exactly what a customer needs is a team of a VAR and a systems integrator and maybe a specialist consultant, because the problem they're trying to solve and the way they're trying to solve it, that's what they need. They need some specialties coming together or some different perspectives coming together. So it's not always just let me think about the right kind of help I need and let me go find exactly that help. To your point, Eric, it can be an ecosystem that you're looking for and maybe a team of people to help you out.
Right. And it also depends on, use a home building analogy. Are you going to be the general contractor, or are you hiring a general contractor who's going to bring the team together?
Well, but I think it's kind of a natural progression of what we're talking about here is, we are drilling down. We've gotten to the point that, we've talked to a systems integrator about how we're wanting to do this. We're going through some level of tool selection. That's kind of where resellers might come in. And, to you guys' point, there's a lot of overlap there, right? So, systems integrators can be resellers. They're not always. We actually don't resell much software, a little bit. But, where does the software itself come from, right? So, or any of the components, and it's the vendors, whether they're ISVs, independent software vendors, or hardware vendors, et cetera. So, what are some of those functions there?
Well, and I think there it also depends on what your focus is or what the breadth of what you're looking to do is. So you can have some software vendors who provide, suites of functionality. I guess they're the business department's equivalent of a Microsoft Office versus just going and buying Word or Excel or something like that. So do you get, one platform from a single vendor, or do you go for a best of breed approach and people who are specialized in a particular area? Maybe it's requirements management, or maybe it's asset management, as opposed to someone who provides PLM and MES and shop planning and, ERP or accounting all in the same solution.
And I think, I know we've talked about trying not to favor anybody on the episode today, and I don't think we want to, but I do want to name some names because, Eric, as you mentioned those, I think it's good for people to maybe associate some names with the kind of categories we're talking about, right? So in these ISVs or independent software vendors, like Jen just mentioned, you've got folks like Dassault and Siemens and PTC and Autodesk who offer a lot, right? There are a lot of different software tools and systems that they offer, and it's a very broad offering. But I think they are primarily focused on this product digitalization space. And then you've got folks who maybe have some offerings here, but they're also very broad vendors like an Oracle or an SAP, right? Oracle offers all kinds of technology and components and platforms and ERP systems, but they also do PLM. Then you've got folks, an SAP, and the same sort of voice there, right? ERP, but other tools. Then you've got folks who are very focused with the system or tool they offer, like an Eris, right? They're offering a PLM system and a lot of capabilities within it, but not also CAD and not also, ERP functions and MES functions and those kinds of things. So even within that ISV space, there are tons of variety of what people offer. And of course, people are changing all the time too, right? I can think of another great example here. ANSYS, right? ANSYS is a very simulation-focused vendor, but they acquire people and they grow their portfolio, and now they have platforms for managing data and simulation capabilities all across the spectrum. So, yeah, but there's a lot going on in that ISV space.
Well, yeah, and Eric, you had mentioned basically the big approach, the platform approach, if you will, and then versus like best in class. So, for instance, Siemens has an MES system as part of their offering, but then again, you've got companies like iBase-T that's all they do. Or, to your point, analysis, Altair, ANSYS, et cetera. Yeah, they do a little bit of simulation data management, but they're a simulation company. So there's all of those kind of companies. And then there's the software that is behind or underneath all of that. And it's the people that nobody really knows about, the component providers, right? So the companies like TechSoft 3D or the Siemens, it used to be Siemens PLM. I think it's now Siemens Digital Industries, where they're providing the Parasolid components or the data translation. Dassault's got a branch too, Spatial, that provides those kind of tools that builds into the different applications.
Yeah, the components, the kernels, the things underneath. Yep. And I think as you were mentioning other, specialist software vendors, there are some interesting ones too that you don't think of them as a specialist vendor, but they are, right? Like Infor has a PLM solution, and maybe that fits back in that category I mentioned, like SAP and Oracle earlier. They have lots of things, and they have some PLM components too. Another fun one, because I just have to get this joke in there, is Microsoft. A lot of people don't realize Microsoft is in the PLM space. They have a very popular tool there. It's called Excel. I don't know if anybody's heard of it, but ching. I think there are a lot of vendors that are maybe not well known, and we won't be able to list them all, so I won't even try. But folks who do something best of breed, and you have to think about back maybe in that earlier step when we were talking about guidance and people helping you figure out what you need, that can help you find the right functions, capabilities, point solutions, platforms, etc., to give you what you want in terms of capability. But there's a lot out there to sort through, which is why some of those guidance type folks exist.
Well, and you've got specialties like requirements management, like JAMA, or you've got, bill of material management. That's not what's done in your ERP system with folks like OpenBOM. And then you've got platform different vendors. You've got on-prem vendors, and you've got cloud vendors, and you've got, solutions you can buy on the internet, and other ones you have to have a salesperson for. So you've got things that run on top of Salesforce, like Propel, or something like OpenBOM, as we talked about. Or
that brings up a whole nother area, Eric, right? As we step from what we think of as a software vendor to maybe a solution provider whose tool runs on the cloud, you have to also think about, well, what are all the components? Jen mentioned some, right? Technical components like kernels and solid model translators and things like that. But there's I'll say the even more vanilla plumbing sometimes about, like, what about web servers, components from Apache? What about database servers, SQL Server from Microsoft and the database from Oracle? And operating systems, what are we running on? Windows or Linux or, that kind of thing. We can't forget about those, because depending on the solution you find, you may have to make those part of the solution that you're building. Or if you're going with a cloud vendor, maybe they do it all for you, but maybe it's somewhere in the middle. You're not buying the operating system and the database but you're going to go with a cloud provider like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud, and you're going to buy some digital software and run it on that platform. But there are a lot of choices to make there, and a lot of pros and cons.
And it's even more complicated than that, because there are industry specific vendors as well, right? So even you take something like the MES space, and you've got something like critical manufacturing that's doing semiconductor, and you've got someone like iBase-T that's doing aerospace. And if you're buying industry-specific solutions for part, do you look for industry-specific solutions for the other components, or do you then have to find a way to integrate those to a more general solution for another part of the business you're trying to operate. So, do you use maybe a general PLM and an industry-specific MES or vice versa?
That's another place where the guidance comes in, right? And there's another category I want to get to here in a few minutes about, regulatory and requirements. But you bring up a good point about what are the constraints you're dealing with in your particular industry or market or whatever it might be that are going to shape some of this. Because to your point, let's take iBase-T as an example. Let's say you're serving an aerospace and defense manufacturer. That may mean certain things to you when it's time to figure out where you're going to run that software. Oh, I'd like to run it on cloud. That's what my IT group is doing now. Okay, but I have ITAR data, restricted data in there that I have to keep in the US. Well, when I go looking for a cloud vendor, I need to think about that. And there's a lot of things to consider, and you have to sort of sort through who does what to figure out who to talk to. And it goes back to that education piece you mentioned a minute ago.
Well, and I think we want to be careful to I don't want to give the impression that it's a linear progression. It's not. It's definitely going back to okay, as you get deeper into the process, the digital transformation process, it's okay, now we've uncovered this piece. How does that affect what we want to do and who we want to do it with and the tools that we need?
One other complication is that, so you've got even the vendors who sell the large complex suites, it's not always that all of their components work together. And so, how do you deal with, a situation like that? How do you make those parts talk together? And when do you, even if you work with a company, a Siemens or a Dassault that's got everything, maybe there's a piece you don't want because it doesn't talk well to the other pieces or it doesn't fit your industry. And then, what other solution should you look, given the one solution that you've picked? There's a lot of complexity to what's going to work best.
And how are you going to make them talk together? And now you're back to systems integrators.
Right. And potentially specialty tools, right? Integration tools that understand the kind of data that you're trying to connect together because you've picked best of breed or whatever it might be. That's a great one, Eric. And I think it comes back to educating yourself and knowing who you're talking to with what bias. Because like you said, some of the big vendors, they'll acquire other companies. And, within a month or two, the marketing's caught up and, hey, that's part of our suite. But, the reality is it might be a year or 2 or 5 before those tools work together.
What? You mean just because a big vendor has all these tools, they don't all work together easily?
Oh, no, it's a shock. There's another one I wanted to dive into, though, on this vendor front that's not always obvious. And it comes back to the point you made, Jen, about it's not a linear process. You might iterate through this a few times. I'll give you an example. Customer we worked with, they had this plan. The strategy was, let's bring our global engineering centers together so we can work around the clock, get everybody on the same page. You know what we need? We need a PLM system to do that. It'll give us the processes. It'll be great. Well, but what they realized pretty quickly was to do that, people need to be working on the same CAD tools, and they needed to share a lot more of the resources about how they did that. And the non-obvious thing they figured out was what we need is remote desktop capability for all the CAD power that we need, right? So we can't any longer have CAD workstations in each of these geographies running independent CAD tools. What they needed was to put the CAD tools in the data center with specialized hardware, with graphics cards and that kind of thing, so that everybody was kind of singing off the same sheet of music using the same tool set to accomplish that business objective of unifying processes and working around the clock and that kind of thing. It struck me, and I wanted to mention it when we're talking about vendors here, because hardware vendors can matter to this also. Not all the time, right? Because buying a server is buying a server these days. It's not that there's a lot to say about that. But you do end up needing to look at specialty things like, am I going to get graphics cards from NVIDIA? Can those run in the data center? Am I doing that? I need their hardware in a workstation that I buy from Dell or Lenovo, or those kinds of things can still be part of this that you need to figure out.
Well, and do you need local caching, for example? So you need, even if you've got a data center, do you need local servers somewhere to address certain things? I mean, we're talking about, at least on the engineering side, really large files that take a long time to move.
Yeah. And I mean, it is sort of odd to mention this name here, but more than once on a project, I've heard people bring up AT&T and needing to talk about their network, right? I mean, it's relevant.
Right. You're right. Networks are relevant, particularly relevant, in fact.
We can't forget that this space these days also veers into hardware like machine shops, machine tools, 3D printing, things like that. So there's other hardware that can come into focus. Now, I don't think we want to get too far afield because we're talking about digital here, but there's a connection.
I would argue that additive manufacturing is awfully digital.
Yeah, but hard to do it without, right?
So, yeah, I mean, there are, right? there are the big providers like, HP, 3D Systems, Stratasys, Markforged. So yeah, there are players out there too. I agree. It's a little bit outside of kind of where we're talking about right now, but it needs to be acknowledged. It's a piece of digital transformation.
Yeah, well, it's not too crazy because to your point, if you're really transforming the way your business operates in the way some people are trying to do it and saying, look, I'm going to get rid of the one big factory and I'm going to build 10 micro factories around the geography I'm serving. And I'm going to do that through a lot of additive. Well, that changes a lot of things about your business, obviously. But in this area, this digital space, you have to consider that. What does that mean? Do you need to go with one vendor so that, your one 3D printing or additive manufacturing vendor works with your whole digital solution? The point is you have to think about it all maybe holistically before you dive too deep into that kind of project. And that makes this part of that ecosystem.
That's a good point.
So one that we mentioned a few minutes ago that I think is relevant is what constrains or maybe guides these projects, things that we need to think about that are sometimes hidden in terms of governance. Regulation, I think, is a big one. We mentioned ITAR a few minutes ago. That's not the only one out there, but sometimes what you're trying to accomplish or how you're trying to accomplish it is shaped by some governmental body, whether it's in the US or in Europe or anywhere in the world, people who are saying you have to do it a certain way, right? ITAR being the example of you can't have defense data outside of the US. Not only that, you can't access it when someone is outside of the US, even if the data stays in the US. Those kinds of things. It's tricky, but it's a factor in these projects.
I mean, it gets further than that. You talk about maybe the Department of Defense for someone, again, an aerospace manufacturer who's working on a program for the Air Force or the Navy or whatever. And, their data has to be secured. And so it doesn't mean you can't have something in the cloud, but it means it has to be a secure cloud. And even your email systems that integrate to it have to be secured. So there's a whole different set of infrastructure you might need depending on the regulations you've got, not just ITAR regulations, the FDA, depending, if you're making equipment for, food processing, Department of Defense, if you're doing aircraft, and there's all kinds of different regulations. And, maybe you're international. And so you've got different regulations in each country or each region that you've got. The EU has regulations on things like that as well. I was looking at a project the other day, and it was to really do a fighter jet, but it was going to be done in Europe based on U.S. designs, and so it could only be worked on with citizens that were from NATO countries. How do you manage that? It's not just one country, it's not just one area, it's not just one nationality. It's a combination, but it crosses different boundaries. So how do you set up a system to manage that?
Yeah. And there's probably not a lot of need for doing that, which means that it's likely going to be custom or bespoke to figure out what's all the hardware, cloud, software, et cetera, you put together to do it. So you want some creative minds figuring out how you accomplish that. That's a great example of how multiple regulatory requirements can come into play. I think there are other things beyond just regulation that can factor in, right? There's things that are just standards that you might have to deal with in your industry, automotive standards, aerospace standards, those can play a role in a way that you need to consider.
Well, certainly, and particularly when you're talking about communicating data in any shape or form, standards play an important role in this is how we do that. When you're talking about ISO standard or NIST, for example, with regard to STEP or I don't want to say IGES because nobody uses IGES anymore, but it's a thing.
Really old thing.
Well, we're a really old group of people here, so. Well, I guess the additional point to make would be it's not just about how particular industries do it or how to communicate data. One of the biggest important ones is that you guys had touched on is security, right? And maintaining that the data is secure, access is secure, and that's a big one these days.
Yeah, it brings up another point that comes up in some projects, and that's about longevity of data, right? Because there are sometimes regulations around how long you have to keep things and how you have to validate that it hasn't changed over time. Several of those industry regulators will require that. And sometimes it's not even that. It's just the business that you're in. If you're going to maintain somebody's aircraft for 50 years, wow, that's
that data
holding on to
needs to be
data for a
around.
long. Yeah, exactly. And frankly, I don't have a punch card reader. So it's it's
you
tricky.
Still have the slide rule, though.
That's right. But it brings up some points that you have to consider where you want to think about it when you're thinking about this space. You want to think about the time frame of your project and how long you'll keep the tools and what will you do when you're done with these tools and you need a new set, which goes back to that ecosystem point, makes this kind of a continuous process that you're thinking through about how do you go digital and stay digital over time and what are the constraints you need to keep in mind.
Well, that's another reason why standards are important too, is that, you're going to be passing off your information to somebody, whether it's in your company or outside your company. And so if you're not communicating it in a standard fashion around certain defined processes or data models or whatever the case is, then you don't have that longevity that you need. You don't have that flexibility that you need when the world changes in a way that you didn't expect, and you have to do something with that data or with that product.
That, I think, helps us zoom out a little on this whole process, Eric, right? When you think about all of the digital content that we're talking around, when we talk about this ecosystem of players and who does what and when, it's just a reminder that the data that we're generating about the products that we're interested in designing or making or whatever we're doing, that data is very valuable, that you're putting a lot of time and energy and money into creating that data. And you want to think about how you curate that, how you care for it, how you manage it, how long you can use it. Are you creating friction in the process for using it? Those kinds of things. And that this governance layer is an important place to think about that when you're trying to decide what kind of project am I doing? How does it fit in over the long term to my business? That kind of thing.
Well, Jen had mentioned earlier some of the behind the scenes software players that really are really the folks who set a lot of the standards for data interoperability. So, because other people need to use what you've done. So maybe it's visualization tools, or maybe it's data, data can be transferred at a lower level. Even something as basic now as 3D PDF. That's a way that's a standard that's set up that allows people that don't have the tools you use to look at the information that you've created and get value from it. And so, it's not just, an engineering standard. It's maybe a visualization standard or a data standard or a transmission of data standard. All those background standards that are technology things, but that are so crucial to actually making the systems work across organizations, industries, governments, whatever.
Yeah, it makes me think of one that I think is particularly fun. Some of the standards around gaming visualization, right? We don't think of that as having to do with this industry necessarily, but I've had some fun conversations with folks when they say, yeah, I've got all the right CAD models and everything for my product, but I'd love to get product placement in that next video game. What? But it's to your point, sometimes the standards that you care about and the formats are beyond what you think of today and maybe what's traditional inside the engineering world, but those are relevant and they're important to consider.
Well, certainly it's, when you look at the visualization aspects of things, gaming has done a lot to drive expectations and enhancement of existing CAD tools, anything that uses graphics.
That's another hardware vendor category I didn't even think about bringing up, right? All the XR, virtual reality, augmented reality, all of that stuff. We could keep talking about this for hours and keep coming up with things we've forgotten. I think we've definitely covered a lot of ground in terms of who's who in the zoo, right? That was our goal, is to talk about this space and the different kinds of vendors and people who are out there, what roles they play, sometimes what kind of overlap they have, and how you might use them to get to the business objectives that you have related to product digitalization and doing something digital with your manufacturing. So I think we've covered a lot. I don't know about you guys.
No, I agree. We have definitely covered a lot. Hopefully it's explained or given you some guidelines, where to start, who to revisit, like the progression itself. Just a place to start. That's where we're looking to be.
You've been doing this a while, Eric. Any advice that you would give folks as they think about how to proceed into this landscape?
Well, I guess the best advice I find is always to simplify. Figure out what you need, or at the level that's easiest to start with, and start. You can start anywhere on this path. So just pick a place to start, and the people you're working with will know the things outside of their realm. They can point you to the next place on the path. And if you have questions as to either where to start or, within a certain area, who are the players there, we can give specifics. Reach out to us, let us know, shoot us a message, and we'll tell you folks that serve a certain area that might be able to help you out. That's kind of what we do for our customers, and that's what we can do for anyone who's listening to the podcast that has specific questions. But don't try to figure out everything before you get started. Some of it won't matter to you because it'll be behind the scenes stuff, or the vendors you're working with will have it covered. But make sure that you do recognize that all these things exist in the background, and make sure that those gaps are filled.
Thanks, Eric. Those are all great points. Yeah, very good advice. All right, well, that is it for today. I want to thank Jonathan for joining us and Eric for lending your expertise and valuable advice. As I always say, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to share some experiences, if there's any topics you'd like us to cover in future podcasts, please reach out, make it a conversation. We're here to listen. And until next time, stay sharp.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening in to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. We appreciate you. If you have any questions or comments for our podcast team, or have an idea for a new topic for our team to cover in 2024, please send an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We would love to hear from you. Until next time, stay sharp.